breaks the power of sin and darkness, whose love is mighty and so much stronger. The King of glory, the King above all kings.
Welcome back to Digging for Treasure. So I wonder how you are this morning. It's Monday morning, and we're going to, the lockdown seems to be beginning to ease a little bit, according to the Prime Minister. But I was thinking we don't just need a pandemic to have a lockdown. What I mean is this: we discover from the life of Elijah that he, as we'll see, he enters a kind of a spiritual lockdown due to his own downfall. So welcome back to the Monk Breton studio, and we're looking at 1 Kings. We're back in 1 Kings, and today chapter 19. I was thinking actually when I first started this, I thought perhaps chapter 17 we might cover at the beginning of the lockdown, some weeks ago now of course, and then we moved into chapter 18 and chapter 19, so it might be indeed we actually finish looking at the life of Elijah and learning from his life, Elijah the Tishbite. So thank you to Alex who did the presentations last week on the covenants of God. So there's a bit of variation if you want to catch up on previous episodes. Well, back in chapter 17 verse 1, we first met Elijah under the Lord's command to declare to King Ahab a judgment from God due to the sin of the nation from the top down. And what was the judgment? A drought. 3.5 years later, chapter 18 verse 1, this time Elijah announces the drought is over, rain is on the way. This was demonstrated by a showdown between Elijah, representing of course the one true living God, and the false prophets of Baal. There was only ever going to be one outcome, the Lord God, in terms of the winner. And indeed it was one of the most dramatic episodes of the Bible. Read it, chapter 18. So Elijah is on a high, and really on the back of this drama, incredible action. The way God was working in and through Elijah's life was truly awesome stuff. And I mean, if you've missed it, please read the build-up in chapter 17 and the climax in chapter 18. So the build-up in chapter 17, the climax in chapter 18. Indeed, it seems such was the adrenaline at the end of chapter 18, as we come to this chapter 19, Elijah, he manages to run ahead of King Ahab to Jezreel, where the king's wife, Jezebel, was residing in the royal palace. The phrase, out of the frying pan into the fire, comes to mind. However, never mind the adrenaline, the Lord's Spirit was well and truly upon Elijah. God's blessing and power, as we saw there in the last verse of chapter 18. Now, if you were in Elijah's shoes, what would you expect to happen next? Well, King Ahab, he of course turned up, he caught up, surely won over by Elijah and all that had happened on Mount Carmel. He would tell Jezebel all that had happened. Yeah, that's what happened. To a point, chapter 19, verse 1, now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then what? Well, surely Jezebel would turn to the Lord. Surely there would be this ongoing revival from the top down, from royalty, from the royal palace, down to everyone else, to the rank and file. Well, does that happen? Let's have a look. Indeed, there's no mention of the Lord by King Ahab, as we saw there in verse 1. Then verse 2, a terrifying message. Verse 2, Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them, one of the prophets that, several prophets that she had murdered in cold blood. So it's a message that Elijah, from Jezebel, would be assassinated within 24 hours. Remember her record, as I've just said, she's already killed prophets of the Lord, chapter 18 verse 4, how would you expect Elijah to respond? Consider his record. He'd walked so closely with the Lord, faithfully and fruitfully in everything, in public and in private, even on his own in self-isolation. Surely with the experience and the events of chapter 17 and chapter 18 behind him, this was no big deal, because he was on the Lord's side. But wait, there's a turn of events. And here we are given an insight into Elijah's spiritual life once again, but this time it's a spiritual nosedive. And a spiritual nosedive, what happens? Well, verses 3 and 4, Elijah was afraid, or as some translations put it, Elijah saw and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went a day's journey into the desert. He came to a broom tree, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. "I've had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." Well, Elijah, he's afraid. He saw. And this time he runs away. He runs away from the action. Previously he ran to the action under the Lord's command. Now he runs away without no command from the Lord. Indeed, such is his decline, his spiritual decline. He is now suicidal. How can this be? What? How can this be? Elijah suicidal? How can Elijah enter such a dark place? How can he enter this period of depression after his successes for the Lord? Now I know there are different kinds of diagnoses for depression, which requires different types of treatment. But what I want to focus on here is the link between Elijah's spiritual life and his mental health. From our perspective, if we read this account for the first time, when we least expected it, smack. It's right between the eyes. What's gone wrong for Elijah? I think there's several factors at work here that combine and culminate in his depression. The spiritual warfare taking place, and that's a theme I'll speak about another day, as it's not specifically addressed here, but I think it is there. Physical tiredness. After all that had happened on Mount Carmel, then there is this extraordinary journey from there to here to Jezreel, which is about 17 miles. So far so good. Then he hears about the death warrant from Queen Jezebel, and as we saw verse 3, ran for his life. Last time in a similar situation, when he ran for his life, that was because the Lord told him so, back in chapter 17, verses 2 and 3. But there's no word here from the Lord. However, he runs for his life, first to Beersheba, and that's way, way south, in Judah, about 120 miles, approximately 6 days' journey for a traveller in normal circumstances. Then leaving his servant behind, there's the day's journey into the desert, as we read. Surely by now he is totally exhausted. He's wiped out. Rest is very important. It's important to you and I. It's like an elastic band. If you keep stretching this band without allowing the band to return to its normal position, well, it will begin to deteriorate. And the more you stretch it without allowing it to return, well, eventually, of course, it will snap and far more serious damage is done, which takes much longer to recover from. If you don't rest, okay, not only something physically will snap, but your mental stability also will be affected. I knew a pastor, a friend of mine, and he worked every day for months on end. He never took a day's rest. And then, of course, eventually he just burnt out and he crashed. And he was off work, ill, for numerous months until he recovered. Work and rest is a healthy balance, especially the Sabbath rest, 1 day a week from your normal work. God rested on the seventh day. He sets the pattern. Now Elijah, clearly, it seems to me there's no rest. He certainly surpassed 6 days, 7 days at least, more, without rest. You see, you, even as a Christian, even with the power of the Lord upon you, you are not invincible. No one is indispensable either. If you don't rest adequately and appropriately, well, I think it's foolishness. It's not an excuse. It's not an excuse for laziness. It's about balance. You're in it as you serve the Lord, not just for the sprint and then collapsing, but for the long haul. and that includes sensible periods of rest. There's something else here too, even more critical. Elijah has become very self-centered, and that is a classic sign of spiritual depression. And this is the main point I want to make, that the Lord was no longer at the center. It was himself, Elijah. Do you see that in verse 4, when he prayed that he might die? I've had enough, Lord. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. And so, instead of looking to the Lord for guidance, as he'd always done, he was focused on Jezebel and her murderous threats. He'd lost sight of the Lord, and he saw only a woman filled with this hatred fury. He prayed that he might die. Just as well, the Lord doesn't answer all our prayers. Elijah had taken his eyes off the Lord. There was no longer this sense of Elijah walking with the Lord. You know, like when the word of the Lord would come to Elijah. Well, we don't read that here. It's like, well, he's taken his life out of God's hands into his own hands. In chapter 18, we saw how Elijah prays for the right thing and the Lord answered. Here he prays for the wrong thing, and thankfully the Lord did not answer. God is good in both responses. So, do you see what has happened? Elijah, a man just like us, encountered a serious problem. Not as he encountered Jezebel, the threat, not helped by his physical tiredness. He lost sight of the Lord. He was out of step with the Lord. Then it suddenly hit him. The sun no longer shone, and he was surrounded by dark clouds. He could take it no more. It was, all things considered, a spectacular collapse into spiritual depression. The light went out. Perhaps you are going through something similar. Take heart, the Bible does not gloss over human failures or weaknesses. In Elijah's position of weakness and utter despair, at least he cries out to the Lord. He cries out to God. There in verse 4, I've had enough, Lord. He pours out his heart. He pours out his heart. He tells God how he is really feeling. When did you last do that? It might be as COVID-19, this pandemic, continues to have a hold upon our lives, that you are in a spiritual nosedive, or that you've already hit rock bottom because of this, or perhaps some other reason. Well, why not tell the Lord? Tell him all about it. As I finish, there's a wonderful Psalm 62, verse 8. Psalm written by David, King David. Trust in him, that's the Lord. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your hearts to him, for God is our refuge. Will you do that? Then, as Elijah discovered, God can begin his healing in your life. Well, please join me again tomorrow as we learn more from the life of Elijah, as James wrote, a man just like us.